Mexico, the earliest peoples were the Spaniards, the conquistadors that came in from Spain out of Mexico, and they went north and had the Mexican population. When they got up in here, they were into the native people, the Apaches, the Navajo, and then we had the Comanches and we had the Apaches even over here in our area.
They were nomadic, they moved. They moved with the herds, with the buffalo herds. So they would be behind, but they would stay not close, but they were not too far off from the herds of buffalo that were moving and migrating in the seasonal aspects in the region through here. And, you know, and then of course the Indians that were closer, they would forage out to the mountains around Fort Stockton and then back up into Carlsbad and then back up into the northern, you know, the mountains west of us to get game. If they didn't have, they would go after deer, and then they would go after the antelope. They would shoot a rabbit. Squirrels, if they were in the mountains. You stop and think about ducks and geese. You know, that's a seasonal thing that's gone on for thousands of years, you know, the migration. So if they were in the spring, they might have a migration of geese and ducks going north. But then you had your quail, you had prairie chickens and a few varieties of turkeys in the northern New Mexico. A lot of our turkeys in southern New Mexico were brought in and turned loose. Juan Onate was a conquistador, basically he was a Spaniard, but he came in with an expedition out of Mexico. And he forged up the Rio Grande and all the way up into what we call Santa Fe, up in that area of the country. But he encountered, you know, the native tribes, the native people, the Indians. He brought in the Catholic Church. He brought soldiers. I think he had 126, 25 soldiers that came with him. But he forged his way up into that area. But when he came through, he brought 1,000+ sheep. He brought close to 1,000 head of cattle. He brought horses. He brought chickens. He brought swine. Swine are pigs. He brought animals that were not native. He brought all of the livestock to New Mexico up into that region up there. And over time, animals got out of the way and became feral. If you want to use that, like the feral hogs in West Texas and down in South Texas and in the southern states. And so, but the Indians, you know, captivated on that in that area, in that region at that time. And then, you know, at that particular time in season, they didn't have horses. And so they took on the horses. And they learned, and then the Indian cultures on the Plains Indians, they learned how to you know, raise a horse and have horses, begin to ride the horses. That was not part of their culture at that time.
Yes.
And these are the mesquite beans. They would actually eat the beans when they were ripe, and these are getting riper when they're soft and they start changing color from the green. They would peel that out and they would eat the stripping, the internal tissues in here, and then kind of suck on the beans. There's a protein factor on the inside of it that is full of sugars. And that's the reason the cattle and the animals like this so much, because it's got the sugar content. Now the outside shell is bitter. They did grind it. These beans are extremely hard, and so Indians use their matates and on surface areas where they had rock formations where they did grinding, they would grind into a coarse flour called pinole. It is more like a cornbread, and they would make the pinole, grind it up, collect it, and then add a little water to it, and they make a mush cake on a flat rock next to the fire to cook it. So they had like a cornmeal flattened pancake thing.
When you talk about the Cap Rock and the Llano Estacado high plains that runs all the way up here into Amarillo, back to Lubbock, back down to Midland, Odessa, back around to Wink and Jow, and then back, that's considered, that was a no man's land. It was hostile environment, the heat, the sun, the blazing temperatures if you were out here in the summertime. And we had a few playa lakes that were, if there's a right rainfall, those playas would have water in them.
And a playa is a low sucking spot in the soil. And sometimes they have drainage coming into them. And then we have a big monsoon, big thunderstorm comes in, and we get 2 or 3 inches of rain or more over a couple of days, and the water runs into these shallow, low-lying depressions. And some of them are on sand, or percolation is a term I'm going to use here, where the water begins to seep through the soil. That's a dry playa, because there'll be water there for a while, but over time, over a week or whatever else, you'll start seeing the water recede, and it's going down to the ground, and then it's air evaporating too with the wind. Now, wet playa is different. Wet playa has clay or a muck bottom in it, and it holds the water. It will it will evaporate and it will shrink in size, but there'll be water in there until, if you don't have any more rain to fill it, then over time it will dry up just from the heat and the air evaporation. But it's not losing water through the soil. That's the difference. Because there's a clay barrier there that's holding the water to the surface. The front of the museum in the nature trail, so the one with the fish pond is actually the representation of a wet playa. Because they're in a wet playa, you have ducks and geese, and you might have fish, frogs. Fish eggs collect on duck feet, on their feathers, and so they land on those ponds, and so they end up bringing a fish population to those playas up in those areas. But again, the other one out here, just off of where the pond is out here, is a dry playa. It's a sunken spot in the ground. Water goes in there, but over time the water disappears.
A natural surface groundwater on the top of the ground was far and few people who would start digging wells, and they would hit groundwater. And then once the word got out that, hey, we've hit water in eastern New Mexico, that was here comes Sickle. Come on, we've got water now. We know how to get water.
The water here, they were hitting the shallow water in the eastern side of New Mexico, and back then we had a lot of water that was shallow, like 30, 40 feet. Like all of our wells today are drilled down below the caliche, down in the underground part of the water, the reservoir, the Ogallala. And what they were getting was just surface rainwater that would accumulate on top of the caliche in pools, and that's on top surface migration going down. So they would dig a well. Once they hit water, then they had buyers, and then go to the next place, and then to dig another well.
The word is go west, young man. Go west to make your money. Go west and dig gold. Go out. There's fortunes to be made in the west. So there was a migration of folks coming this way into Lee County, and they would come up and connect with the Goodnight Climbing Trail, which is a cattle trail, but the Oregon Trail and the Western Trail that were going to Washington, Oregon, and California, that were more northern of us, and another group that was coming up here north and coming down. And there was another trail that come up out of El Paso area.
Actual wagon trains, when they were coming this way, the guides, the bushwhackers, all those people that were going out and blazing the trails, would tell these people what they needed to have and get it all ready to go. You had a mom and dad, and then the two kids, you were going to get about 400, 600 pounds of staple items and bring with you. To have 200 pounds of sugar, 100 pounds of lard, have 4 or 5 cows with them. So they would butcher a cow, on the way for food. They'd have, and if they had an old milk cow, they would have her on the back of the wagon. They'd milk her, and then you see the wagon, the prairie scooters, or as they're called too. You see a bucket swinging under the belly of the wagon. As they were going on their daily journey, that thing swinging back and forth. By the end of the day, it had a lump of butter in it. So they had fresh butter every day. And then they would bring fresh eggs with them, and then they'd bring the chickens. They would take a crate and they would fill that with bran flour, but they would lay their eggs in the bottom. The jostling of the wagon didn't break the eggs.
In the wagons when they came, the settlers, they didn't bring their recliner, they didn't bring their couches. They tried that, but as they moved across the country, those items were left alongside the trail. They had to have things that they could survive with. And a chest of drawers, a bed, household furnishings like that were just taking up valuable space in the wagons. And then they'd get hung up in mud, they'd get hung up in rivers where they were crossing different places. And so that became a burden, and so stuff got tossed. But then you had to have tools. You had to have stuff like horseshoes and tools and saws that would cut wood, cut timber, because they didn't carry spare tires. And the tire they had was made out of tree trunks and branches. But they had to have tools and equipment on that wagon stored to repair broken spokes. It's like a bicycle wheel. You have spokes, the little metal lines that come off onto the axle are metal spokes. And on a wagon wheel, you have a wooden rim, and then you have metal on the outside, and then you have wooden spokes going to the hub in the center that went to the axle on the wagon. And if that broke going across a gully or coming out of a river bottom, or you got into a rocky, craggy area as they traveled over, because remember, they were blazing the trail. There's no highways, there's no paved road surfaces. They're going across mountains or cutting across deep ditches, and and oxen and horses are pulling the wagons, and so they would break stuff. So you had to have the equipment to repair it. And so when you think about eastern New Mexico, when you drive from here to Clovis and to Lubbock, you see any trees? So they had to bring equipment to repair what they had in that wagon. They would bring some extra wood, and then when they got into the mountains, they would cut trees, they would cut branches, they would cut things that would fit that wheel, and they would actually hone it down, saw it, cut it, plane it. They'd have those instruments in there to make that fit to that wagon wheel. So that was their repair kit. And so you had to have those instruments or else you weren't going anywhere. And it was kind of every man, woman, and family for yourself, basically. I mean, they tried to stay together as groups and for protection and security. But if you really were broke down, you were pretty much left behind to fend for yourself on some of these things. So that's kind of a scary thought, you know. They might put children and women in somebody that could take them, but the men had to stay back that was with that camp. And a lot of times they'd have more than one wagon. That family would have a supply wagon, which was carrying this stuff behind the food wagon. And they didn't sleep in the wagons like you see them in the movies and the westerns. They all had bedrolls, and then most of the people slept under the stars by the fire at night because there wasn't any room in the wagons. You know, television has kind of blown that up out of proportion because we see them getting in the back of a wagon. No, that didn't ever happen. They were basically camping on the ground. That part. Hardy people, tough people.
All of these guys coming from the East Coast, coming this direction and wanting to get into New Mexico, they were living in rich soils back east. They had rainfall. But when you come out here, they're in blazing heat, the high winds, and they tried dryland farming. Now, dryland farming still goes on today in West Texas on cotton crops and on some maize and some sorghum. Drought like we're having right now, you don't grow anything until you have rain. I mean, it may come up in the spring when we have a little moisture, but then the heat takes over, there's no rainfall. We don't have a monsoon season that we're wanting. And so there's no late fall rains to make the crop happen. And so once they started irrigating, they could produce a crop. Most of these people coming in, settling here, they had to grow fruits and vegetables and things to provide for themselves because they were not living off the land other than game, which was deer, antelope. And then at that time, there's still buffalo. They didn't have rototillers, they didn't have tractors. They had mules, they had oxen, they had horses. And they were trained to pull plows. This right here is a hitch that would be put behind a horse or an oxen, or an ox is a cow, and they would pull. This is a double shovel plow cultivator. And what I'm talking about is back here. This is down in the ground, and this is plowing the ground. And the guy's back here holding the handles, and he says "yee" or "ha" to the animal, and after so many years of doing this, the animal knew which way "yee" was right or "ha" was left. But that's the language that the animals know. And they would turn and they'd plow across the fields and see, this is not your modern tractor. And so they had these implements in there because if they were going to come and be farmers, they needed farm equipment. How were they going to farm on their property whenever they came to eastern New Mexico or even into Washington, Oregon, onto the other places they were going? Because there was no stores over on those regions. They were going to new territory, new uncharted land. So they didn't have Walmart. They didn't have a tractor supply store to go to pick up stuff. So they had to make what they needed and carry it with them on that wagon. And there wasn't a lot of supply trains that were, a supply train is wagons coming with meat, coming with vegetables, coming with, it's like your semi trucks on the highway that's bringing food to your local grocery store. They did the local market was your wagons coming back in to supply these areas. And then, you still have the big ranchers here that were moving into this area because they wanted all that rich grazing grassland. As you move into the 1900s, they had oil and gas being found. And that was a red flag for everybody back east to come into that part of the country. So there was two different groups, agricultural, and then you have the mineral portion, which is in your oil and gas industry, that were coming together in this whole quadrant and into West Texas. So this is kind of how we really got started.